At the gates of the HedgeMaze Hotel, a sensible person would turn on their heels and leave. Such a thing has never occurred once because people that find themselves at the gates are seldom sensible. Perhaps Felix was the first sensible person to ever consider stepping through them. It is true that the forest confused him and Genevieve into arriving at the gates, but I like to think that his sensibilities would have guided them there regardless. Still, I wonder if these same sensibilities could survive the journey ahead. If a building could stare with its windows, that was definitely what the manor house was doing to him right now. Peeking through the hedges, it invited him to explore and get lost, an invitation Felix was all too familiar with. On the other hand, Ginny wasn't all that excited. She had seen way too many travelers get lost in this place to believe Felix could brave the journey. So far, by exploring the maze, people have lost themselves, their minds, their marbles, their bones, hair, shoes, one glass eye, and a concernedly long list of imaginable and unimaginable possessions. Once, Genevieve herself almost got lost for good. She let you might say, but she can fly. If I were in her feathers, I would just fly over the entire hedge maze and reach the manor in a jiffy. Well, you have to excuse my sincerity when I say that Ginny's much cleverer than me and you combined. Naturally, she had tried, but no matter how hard she flapped her wings, the manor sat prettily at the horizon, never moving an inch closer. When she looked down to discern a path, the line scrambled her brain, so even a bird's eye view was impossible. Her only choice was to fly away, which fortunately had worked every time so far. Now, she could try and convince Felix of the impossibility of this journey, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. For him, the path ahead was an obvious one, and so he stepped forward with her on his shoulder. Welcome, friends, to the HedgeMaze Hotel. The HedgeMaze Hotel is a collection of far-fetched and courageous accounts of the silly and heartfelt variety. When you don't know where you're headed, remember, you can only go forwards from there. Chapter 1: The Newcomer and the Raven. The hedges surrounded them both. Genevieve was struck by familiarity while riding on Felix's shoulder. There was a rather nostalgic sense of obviousness to his steps. They reminded her of a time when this hedge maze used to have manners, and she used to have opposable thumbs. Those were simpler times, albeit filled with complex research and complicated hedge trimming. You see, this place used to be the home of Professor Georgia Wells and her pupil Genevieve. Yes, the Georgia Wells, perhaps one of the most exploring explorers of history. I'm sure she's still somewhere out there, but since she left, the manor and the hedges have been in quite a disarray. From a young age, Georgia's curiosity and daring nature was second to none. It's likely that she's been to all corners of charted and uncharted territories. Before her back went out of sorts and her knees betrayed her, there was no place she wouldn't fathom braving. Well, there was no place she wouldn't fathom visiting nowadays either. It just became a matter of getting there and back without breaking anything else. Georgia never really considered that her momentum would be taken away from her by her approaching 50s. She would pass away one day, of course, but even then, it would be amidst a rambunctious deed, such as being entombed with a cursed treasure after uncovering the passage to a forgotten subterranean upside-down pyramid. Or likewise discovering a new species of horned owl, much bigger than a giraffe and with actual antlers made of moon crystal, which would tragically proceed to eat her. As daring and admirable these endings may sound, they began to worry Georgia. Why the need to be so eager for an ending at all, when she could still explore for many more years to come? It was silly to admit defeat, for with the right hip replacement, no owl of any size could best her whispering abilities. It was then looking at her maps when she began to consider the matters of distance. The simple fact of these places being far away in concept or geography made them alluring. It invited challenge and nurtured curiosity. It wasn't just about the achievement of hitting their shore. What really endeared Georgia was experiencing the trivialities of daily life elsewhere. There was nothing like having a tea break and a makeshift table at the edge of a cliff in the Sierras with your local fellows as if you grew up there. Nothing like allowing a language you only learned a few weeks ago to slowly warm your vocal cords and settle enough to leave an accent on its way out. And nothing like waking up and realizing that even though you may be leaving in a few days, here felt as much like home as any place at all. Nevertheless, after weeks and weeks of travel, Georgia would begin to miss her house and her office, the place in which the accumulations of self are archived, where her research, photographs, and memories lived. And so, she was left playing a game of ping-pong with the four winds, going back and forth from one place to another. It was like she had a reservation to every mountain, a seat saved in every forest. And I'm sure these places called to her, much like I'm sure the libraries and bookshops we visit on weekends miss us when we are away. But going back to the issue at hand, our plan was in order to make sure Georgia's knees survived a few more years without getting completely jumbled. And the solution was very simple. She would wrestle the four winds and find the heart of a forest. Then she could trim the angles of reality by pruning the flora into a massive garden, making the matters of distance an afterthought. Albeit a bit unruly at times, it indeed worked. This invention ushered a shining period to Georgia's exploring career, for now the whole world was just in her backyard. On a regular day, Georgia would wake up, have a cup of tea, and go on a short walk into the hedges, at which point she would end up in the middle of a bazaar under the scorching sun of a desert. There she would acquire an artifact by definitely not cheating in a game of cards, and be back just in time for brunch. Afterward, she would go back into the hedges, turn a different corner, and find herself at the bottom of one of the oceans, where an underwater survey camp was set up by a lost city. It was part of her afternoon routine to check on the oxygen tanks and continue her observations of the ruins. She often also took the opportunity to enjoy her afternoon tea while looking out into the impossibly vast ocean floor and its many mysteries. Then, she would be back home, just in time for dinner. From one venture to another, she trimmed and cultivated her garden into hundreds of paths that stretched beyond the horizon. The manor gained floors, and the garden became a maze. It was also around that time that she picked up Genevieve as an apprentice. Well, more accurately put, Genevieve picked her up as a mentor. Georgia never really had time for students, pupils, or assistants of any kind, but Genevieve was very insistent. So much so that one morning Georgia was startled awake at the sound of someone knocking. At first, she didn't believe it. Visitors weren't something she remotely expected after moving into the middle of nowhere, or the middle of everywhere. Whichever one made more sense, it wasn't likely that someone was knocking on her door. Yet, all of it was perfectly likely to Genevieve. Not only she was at Georgia's doorstep, but in the likelihood she would be invited to move into the spare room, she had also brought her luggage. Genevieve's insistence did not stem from stubbornness. It rather came from a sense of obviousness that often seemed to trample the relevance of anything close to a faux pas. Though Georgia did notice a genius buried amongst her questions. And after a few cups of tea, and a morning lost in senseful conversation with someone that seemed to make even less sense than her, she too realized the obviousness of the matter. The spare room was indeed Ginny's. In fact, it was silly to build a spare room only to make use of it. Of course, the extra room had always been there, same for the extra study upstairs. And now the manor was completed. Georgia settled on them being collaborators. And despite never once referring to Ginny as a student, one could argue she was the greatest source of homework Ginny's ever had. And they collaborated together for over a year before Georgia disappeared. Her vanishing wasn't foreshadowed by any gloom or dissatisfaction. She wasn't particularly worried or distracted on that day. In the morning, she had enjoyed breakfast with Ginny as it was customary. Then she went about her routine within the hedges. Come evening, she missed dinner, and by breakfast on the following day, she was still late for that dinner. It wasn't long before Ginny put her research aside and began looking within the hedges. After days upon days of doing nothing but search, she found no clue, trace, or note from Georgia. In the eventuality Georgia had to depart unexpectedly, Ginny hoped she would at least leave a note. Although Ginny was unsure if Georgia would leave a note even if she quite expectedly had decided to abscond. Hopefully she was just very, very late for dinner. When Genevieve had searched for long enough, she slept an entire day and returned to her usual routines. She had learned enough about dimensional horticulture from Georgia to at least maintain the hedges in their current state, and she did so week after week, gardening in the morning and working over the remaining hours of every day. Some afternoons she would venture deeper within the hedges, just in case Georgia was around some far corner, but mostly her days were more of the same. Ginny was a brilliant keeper, conservationist, and gardener. Her desk was always filled with bone trinkets, parchment fragments, ceramic shards, and things she had unearthed, catalogued, and preserved from her collaborations with Georgia. The same care she took of her artifacts, she took of the manor and the hedges. At a glance, an observer wouldn't be able to tell time had passed at all during that period. Time could have stopped, and it wouldn't have made any difference. However, that stillness began to bother Genevieve. Her interest in Georgia's work stemmed from its capricious nature, which was of stark contrast to her own. Before meeting her, she wondered how much knowledge was lost in the whimsy of Georgia's adventures. Now, much of it could be found on their shelves, beginning to fill with books and artifacts of their own writings and discoveries. Georgia would write and publish papers from time to time, but they were unintelligibly written in a flurry of ideas and insights, which made them quite funny. Whenever Ginny needed to cite her work, she'd spend a chunk of time reading for their humor. For Ginny, history was about remembrance and connection, and allowing things to wither into forgetfulness was a tragedy. Yet, she felt like she was preserving something that perhaps shouldn't be. Before Georgia came along, there was no manor or HedgeMaze. It was simply a forest. So Genevieve allowed the forest to be. Soon, time resumed and Jeannie allowed the hedges to grow beyond their designs. The forest roots reached the foundations of the manor, and Flora began to drape over its brick walls while Jeannie focused on her research. She took trips within the forest and began discovering things not about deserts far away, but about this mountain, and her gardening shifted from having the branches conform to nurturing their natural growth. What Ginny found within the perfectly organized mess that became of her study was a way to connect with the past, a way to make objects remember, and not any old objects, but ones weathered and cracked by their history. For her first experiment, she chose the skull of a raven, native to this region. The deep crack over one of the eye sockets and the grooves along a slightly hooked beak whispered a story rather perfectly. A once forgotten story that was now about to be remembered. The experiment was rather successful, and Genevieve learned that an artifact's memory could not only be extracted, but experienced and manifested. Inasmuch that her face began to sting, her vision failed, and one of her eyes was lost. Her instinct was to reach towards her face, but her one remaining eye was surprised by the sight of feathered wings instead of arms. The room was much bigger around her, which is to say, she was now bird-sized. It remained unclear if she would have become a kettle had she chosen to experiment with a shard of porcelain instead. Although that wasn't her most pressing concern. Neither was turning back into a person, no. Her most pressing concern were the hedges growing into the house. She perched on the balcony balustrade and looked out. The forest wasn't returning to its original form. Its ecosystem had been deeply changed, and a new kind of wilderness was now growing. So much so that when Jeannie turned to look back inside, she found a hedge wall instead of her study. Around her there were no desks, doors, windows, or balcony, just a lonely balustrade surrounded by hedges affixed to the forest floor. She flew up and over the hedges, only to find that the manor was now sitting prettily at the horizon, and she was lost and unable to reach it. As we very well know, she tried much to no avail, which brings us right back to the present moment. At this point, Jeannie missed a few things dearly: stretching, having opposable thumbs, and afternoon tea. If Felix was patient enough to listen to her, perhaps she would be able to teach him the basics of dimensional horticulture. Well, for that he would also need an applied knowledge of physics, so she should probably come up with a plan B. Traversing these hedges, even before their becoming wild, was not easy without tools. It took over a year for Georgia to do so by instinct, and she achieved it only by the nature of having designed most of these verdant halls herself, as well as having invented all of the tools used for navigation. Felix seemed to navigate the maze without much bother though. He had nothing aside from his intuitions and sensibilities. But if a forest was ever to speak, Felix would be the one able to listen. However, this wasn't just one forest. These hedges contained cities, deserts, oceans, tundra, savannas, volcanoes, and grasslands. And growing wild meant that all these destinations blended together in a cacophony of impossibility. As the hours passed, Felix began to notice some incoherent shifts in nature. Despite being almost 6 p.m., the sun stood above him as if it were midday. Within a span of 2 steps, his compass often decided north was in a completely different direction. Or the hedges would sway with no wind. At one point, he swore he smelled the ocean, but being that he was at the top of a mountain, he dismissed the idea as an impossibility. The sounds of nature were inharmonious here. In the sky, the ground and the winds disagreed far too often with each other to tell him anything of substance. It seemed that this was one of the few places Felix could not listen to or learn much from, and where none of his sensibilities helped him find sense anywhere around any corner. And so, this marked the second time Felix was actually ever lost. The first one being the time that he was lost as a child. As previously mentioned, that was the moment when nature first invited him to listen, and his sensibilities bloomed when getting lost became an opportunity to learn. Now he traveled through this chimeric place where sense was irrelevant, and he wondered what he was being invited to learn, if anything at all. And even though time misbehaved there, enough of it passed for Felix to grow a beard, for him to lose his office job due to absence, and for his neighbor to adopt his plants when his electricity and water were cut. Then, more time passed. His previous employer replaced him about 4 more times in an attempt to find a good fit. His plants had some offspring of their own, which was shared amongst his neighbor's family and friends. His house became home to most stray cats in the neighborhood, and his back garden flourished with fireflies. Besides, his disappearance was not cause for any fuss. It was not unusual for him to extend a hiking trip into a sabbatical and disappear for a while longer than expected. In the meantime, Felix busied himself looking for food and talking to Ginny in order to expand her raven vocabulary. Since his compass, watch, ears, and eyes were futile in discerning so much as a direction, solving the maze became a fruitless endeavor. The hedge walls were tall and irregular, though there wasn't much peril on their track, which was a bit odd for Ginny. Her previous experiences with other travelers proved quite different. Mostly, Felix found dead ends, which opened up into clearings that were rather perfect for camping, considering that the sun, the moon, and the stars practically danced above them. The time of day was as irrelevant as keeping it, so he stopped following his watch, and whenever they were tired, they would camp at a clearing. Besides rest, these clearings offered them food, water, and curiosities. Amongst berry bushes, fruit trees, mushroom logs, and ponds, they also found things like a park bench covered in a soft bed of plants and flowers, a lamppost still working, surrounded by flying moths mistaking it for the moon, an out-of-order phone box covered in moss, and a lonely bus stop sign with no road to accompany it. I believe this was the first time Felix and perhaps Genevieve experienced a true lack of routine. Being forever lost meant there was no work, no research schedule, no impending deadline, no incoming social event, and no angst for productivity. And since the hedges wouldn't tell Felix anything of substance, he began listening to his body instead, which made it all the more easier to look after them both. Despite the inevitability of being lost forever, or stuck as a raven forever, they kept each other in good humors. Genevieve's vocabulary grew, and her vocal cords warmed as she finally had someone to talk to. In due time, they became good friends. It was true that Felix didn't have an applied knowledge of physics, but he did have a unique patience for listening. He thought Ginny was beyond smart, and listening to her was everything but effortful. He even seemed to follow her more obscure ramblings about the nature of her research. It wouldn't surprise her if he could grasp the basics of dimensional horticulture after all. Once unconscious of the magical unusualness of nature here, Felix now began to accept that he indeed smelled the ocean that one time, not by mistake or delusion. He began to accept truths even crazier still, that he could walk for days and not find nightfall, that night could last only a minute, that morning could be flushed with stars and the night stripped of them, that constellations he had never seen could be found in a pond reflecting a different sky than the one above him, that dusk and dawn could meet and morning follow them still, that the phases of the moon could happen in any order it wished, and that sleep could find him under sunbeam or starlight. When Genevieve found she had fully adjusted to her new raven vocal cords, she proceeded to tell Felix a story. She told him of George's disappearance and her own predicament. The Felix who would have disbelieved a talking raven, or a regular raven which does still talk, albeit a bit less verbosely. Anyway, this new bearded version of Felix had experienced enough unusualness to believe that Genevieve was in fact a person. Not any ordinary person, but a collaborator of the Georgia Wells, the youngest explorer to ever go around the world in 79 days. Plus, she used to live here, in the manor house at the center of this maze. I must say, this revelation made Felix feel quite a bit awkward. Not because he was starstruck, no, but because he had given Ginny a lot of scritches and pets. They had also shared a tent. He had farted in front of her more than once, and she had likely seen him naked, because whenever it rained or they found a pond, he would take the opportunity to wash. He had actually given her a bath multiple times at this point too, all of which sounded more awkward with each passing thought, so he immediately blushed. When Ginny noticed, she couldn't help but laugh. It wouldn't be inaccurate to say that Felix spoke to animals much like he spoke to people. Well, I would go as far as to note that his social fluency with animals was actually much greater than with people. So Ginny hadn't put together that he just thought she was a very intelligent raven, which was a really fair yet funny assumption to make. If Felix had been at all rude or condescending, she would have flown away a long time ago. She told him so in a once somber story about the tragedy of her being lost, became placated by the levity and humor of a very different kind of conversation between them. He apologized for not noticing she was a person. She pointed out that she didn't notice that he didn't notice, which is to say he didn't treat her like not a person. He had petted her, yes, but her beak was very sharp, and had he not found the place she'd been trying to scratch for days, that first exchange might have gone quite differently. Besides, she had asked for pets afterwards. They were just kind of nice. Over the sounds of sizzling mushrooms, their conversation elapsed the entire night, which lasted for 2 days. When Ginny came back around to the story behind the manor and the current state of the hedges, Felix asked if she thought Georgia would ever come back. The truth was, Ginny didn't know. She worried Georgia was lost somewhere out there in need of help. Best case scenario, she had been distracted by another shiny adventure and it was just late. It wouldn't surprise Ginny if that was the case. Once, during an archaeological dig, Georgia got stuck in a hole following a moth. They did later discover it was a rare species thought to be extinct, but not before she disappeared for 3 days and came back covered in mud and moths. It wasn't uncommon for this sort of thing to happen, but this time she was almost 3 months late for dinner, and that was before Ginny herself got turned into a raven for many more weeks since then. Even for Georgia, this amount of lateness was a bit of a record. In all fairness, living with Georgia, not even breakfast was safe from an oddity. Their kettle was this ancient piece of porcelain from a tea set they unearthed, and Georgia insisted in keeping it and using it. Honestly, it looked like it would fall apart every time Ginny thought about picking it up. Also, certain animals followed Georgia home for one reason or another. At one point, they had a horse, a camel, an emu, and an army of squirrels parked outside. Genevieve went on and on over the many wonderfully infuriating things regarding her legendary roommate. More than anything, it became clear to Felix how much Ginny was homesick. From the idiosyncrasies she complained much about, to her musings over her study, her shelves, a balcony, and what sounded like an exceptionally comfortable sofa, the manor was a dear place, and the decision to let the hedges grow wild still weighed on her. And it was amidst that long conversation that something rather special happened. A new sensibility matured within Felix, a sort of internal compass primed by Ginny's reminiscing of home. Much like migratory birds can sense the coming of winter and tell which way is north or south, Felix could now tell the many ways towards home. In fact, he began to notice that their time together inside the maze was rather deprived of the dangers Ginny had warned him about. That he often found mushrooms, which was one of his comfort foods, and that despite being lost, it had been a long time since he last felt lost. You see, there are many interwoven paths between the worlds, many more directions than a regular compass can betray, and this was one of them, the path towards shelter, familiarity, and home. Georgia found many of these paths through a deep relationship with her curiosity. With her tools, measurements, and methods of science, before unknown, she found ways to traverse worlds Felix couldn't yet begin to fathom. But this path, the one of home, eluded her, seeing that she was still late for dinner. It was on the third day that Felix and Ginny found morning again. More precisely, morning found them. Sunlight climbed over the hedges, and a wind came to brush Felix's hair. This wind did not sway the hedges or Genevieve's feathers. It was not one of the full winds. It was fresh and meant to wake him with a gentle touch. Usually only found during morning, this wind is preceded by an evening spent in long conversations or a deep focus that produces the good kind of tired that satisfyingly numbs the body and leads to the best stretch one can hope for when waking. This was the same wind that often blew past Felix's back garden, the same wind that often blew through Genevieve's balcony doors. And now it clearly came from just around the corner. When Felix and Ginny had stretched felicitously, Felix turned the corner. There, they found the simplicity of nostalgia and a lonely balustrade rooted to the forest floor. Once more the wind exhaled and kissed their skin, and when they opened their eyes, they saw the entire hedge maze below. Behind them were dusty shelves filled with artifacts, an orderly mess of a writing desk, a few drops of dried blood staining the carpet after an experiment, and an exceptionally comfortable sofa. Thus, they were home. Hi friends, thank you so much for listening to the first chapter of the HedgeMaze Hotel. It makes me so happy to have you, you have no idea. So, the prelude to the next chapter is almost done, and once it's finished, it'll be available early for free in my Patreon. So consider joining the Patreon as a free member to get early access. I'll also be posting updates and news there, so if you want to be a part of the community, that's the place to go. If you would like to further support the show, you can join one of the paid tiers starting at $3. And if you do, you have early access not only to the prelude episodes, but to the full episodes, as well as full transcripts if you like to read along. I can't wait to finish work on the next chapter so I can share with you all. This episode was written, edited, narrated, and stitched together by me. The music and sound effects were provided by various artists, and you can check them out in the show notes together with all the relevant links. Know that you've been a most fortuitous guest, and if you ever find yourself lost again, our services ought to be right round the corner. We hope you've enjoyed your stay, enough to come back to the HedgeMaze Hotel. Bye everyone.